Week 7. Putting it all together. At this point, we've covered all the topics included in this workbook. We'll devote most of this chapter to integrating all the pieces. We'll also discuss a plan to move forward as you wrap up this 7-week program. Last week, we focused on ways to tame your fears, working progressively through a plan to confront them. Before we talk about how to best integrate all the pieces, let's review how things went as you started that process. If you worked on confronting your fears over the past week, take a few moments to consider how things went. What went well with your exposures? Where did you find yourself struggling? If you had a hard time completing your planned exposures, take heart. Many people have a hard time at first, and the vast majority go on to do very well. Review the principles of what makes exposure effective, and choose a more approachable starting point. You might also remind yourself what compelled you to face your fear. What on the other side makes the difficulty worthwhile? Part of the activity plan from last week included monitoring your activities for 3 days. Take a look at your daily activities forms for this week. How do they compare to the daily activities forms you completed between weeks 1 and 2? Is there a difference in the overall level of activity? Also examine the enjoyment and importance columns. Do you notice any changes? Write down your observations in your notepad. Continue to do activities from your list, reviewing week 2 as needed. You've been paying attention to the things your mind tells you for the past 4 weeks. What do you find helpful about this approach? Over the past week, did you notice thoughts that seemed especially important to examine carefully? Are there ongoing challenges you're finding in recognizing and addressing your problematic patterns of thinking? Continue to review weeks 3 and 4 as needed to address issues that come up and to reinforce the material. How did completing the tasks you scheduled for yourself go over the past week? If you've continued to struggle with getting things done, what has gotten in your way? You can review the material in week 5 as needed to address ongoing challenges in this area. Remember to follow the plan closely, especially if you run into difficulty during your tasks. Looking back. When I first came here, I thought I was going crazy. Everything seemed to be falling apart, and I felt like I was drowning. John had completed the acute part of his treatment, and we had decided together to cut back our meetings to once every 3 weeks. In preparation, we reviewed how the treatment had gone for him thus far. When John called me to discuss treatment options, I recognized his name but couldn't place it. Then I realized I'd seen it on the fleet of plumbing trucks that bore his name driving around the suburbs. John's anxiety had grown with his business as he realized he was responsible not only for his own family, but for the families of his employees. Every day he listened with dread to his work voicemail, fearing the call about a major plumbing disaster his company would be responsible for. He'd been spending more and more time at work, much of it worrying and not really being productive. He felt terrible about being away from home as much as he was, and not being as present as a father and husband as he wanted to be. When he was home, he was rarely there mentally as he worried and ruminated about work. He'd stopped spending time with the close group of friends he'd known since elementary school and given up exercise and reading for pleasure. During our first session, he'd told me, "Most of my time I spend working, worrying about work, and feeling guilty for working." Based on his life picture at the time, John's goals were: find balance between work life and home life, worry less about things I can't control, be more productive at work, find time for things that bring me joy. At the start of this 7-week program, you took an inventory of how things were going in different areas of your life. Based on that inventory, you developed specific goals to work toward. Look back at your list of goals. For each one, think about the progress you've made and record your impressions in the space in your notebook. Later in this chapter, we'll discuss ways to keep moving toward your goals. John and I had used a CBT framework to understand his situation. At the beginning of treatment, his thoughts, emotions, and behaviors were working against him in a self-perpetuating cycle. John's anxiety and depression led to his behaviors, isolating himself, no exercise, etc., which in turn worsened his symptoms. Similarly, his thoughts and symptoms reinforced one another, as did his thoughts and behaviors. We started with behavioral activation, finding activities to address the lack of reward he was getting from life, the social isolation, and the worsening depression. We then spent several sessions examining his thoughts, how they were not only unhelpful, but also often untrue. For example, he compared himself unfavorably to his dad, a successful self-employed electrician who never seemed as stressed out as John felt. John came to realize that his dad had far fewer financial commitments and worked in a time when the cost of living was much lower. John also realized that his dad probably felt more stress than John realized as a kid, as John's kids probably weren't aware of his own. Later sessions focused on time and task management, working to help John invest his time productively so he could spend as much time as possible doing what he cared about, especially being with his family and friends. Finally, John practiced facing the fears he had, especially related to something going very wrong at work and his family facing financial ruin. "I think the biggest factor was getting back to the things I love doing," John said. "It feels like I could have changed my thinking and gotten more efficient at work, but I'm not enjoying my life. It's kind of like, what's the point?" John found that adjusting his thinking removed an obstacle to activities he enjoyed. "I used to tell myself, you'll regret it if you're not available when something goes wrong at work. But I realized I couldn't live my whole life waiting for someone's pipes to explode. The only real regret would be if I didn't enjoy my time on Earth." As you think back to when you started this program and the work you've done since then, let's return to the CBT model and see how the pieces fit together. Anxiety and depression, interacting with behaviors. Week 2, behavioral activation. Week 5, time management. Week 6, facing fears. Anxiety and depression, interacting with thoughts. Week 3, identifying thoughts. Week 4, challenging thoughts. And of course, thoughts interacting with behaviors. Think about your experience with each part of the program. Then consider where you found the most benefit. Which parts do you feel went well? Write your reflections in your notebook. I asked John what changed over the past few weeks. He told me a story. "Last week I was in my office at home, and my 4-year-old daughter came in. She was looking for tape or something and didn't realize I was in there. When she saw me, I saw some fear come into her eyes, and she started to back out of the room. She'd gotten so used to me being tense and irritable when I was working, so I must have surprised her when I smiled. When I did, she actually ran to me and gave me a hug. I scooped her up and we talked for a few minutes, and I felt like I was actually seeing her and hearing her for the first time in as long as I could remember, without a haze of dread and worry clouding everything. Then she hopped down, said, 'Bye, Daddy,' and went back to playing." John's voice wavered and his eyes filled with tears. I couldn't help crying afterward. I was just thinking, what's more important than being able to show love to my kids? I felt such a lightness where I'd felt a weight before. Now I don't take everything so seriously, and I actually think I'm better at what I do. Think back over the past 6 weeks. Does any event stand out that makes you feel like you're moving in the right direction? It could be something that happened at work or with your family or friends. It could be a major development or something subtle. Write about the event in your notebook. What do you feel as you think about this event? As we continued discussing what had worked well for John, I pointed out that the improvements he was seeing didn't just happen. They came from changes he made in his thoughts and actions. With that idea in mind, I asked John what specific things he had done to feel better. Together we came up with the following list. Spending more time with friends. Trusting my employees and loosening the reins at work. Difficult. Getting regular exercise. Focusing on my family when I'm with them. Minding my thinking. Different people find different parts of a CBT program more helpful, depending on what they're struggling with and what they need. As you think about the positive changes you've made, what specific things were most helpful? John also noted areas where he continued to struggle. It was hard not to fall back into worries when a situation came up at work. He also found it easy to skip workouts. While John wasn't exactly where he wanted to be in every way, he felt confident he could use his new tools to continue moving toward his goals. No matter how much work we put into a CBT program, none of us meets our goals perfectly or feels like the work is done. In what areas do you want to continue making changes? Which of the tools from the past 6 weeks might be helpful in these areas? Looking ahead. Even after all the work I've done over the past few months, I still get waves of anxiety and worry, John said. But they feel more manageable. It's almost like I feel less anxious because I know I have a way of managing the anxiety. Based on what he'd found helpful, John and I put together a plan for continuing the progress he'd made. He identified 5 main factors that led to his feeling better and organized them into a wellness plan. He chose to arrange the 5 factors into a pentagon, with the sides saying presence with family, regular exercise, practicing trusting my employees, minding my thinking, time with friends. Under each of John's intentions, he listed reminders for himself. For example, under presence with family he included no constant checking of cell phone, focus on person I'm talking to, redirect thoughts when they wander unnecessarily to work, take care of work issues so they don't intrude. John kept a copy of this plan with him to refer to, especially when he found himself struggling. Summarizing what works for you. All of us need reminders of the things we intend to do. Consider again the most helpful changes you made. What will you need to keep in mind to continue feeling well and to address any challenges that might arise in the future? Use the space in your notebook to summarize your own plan. If you need more space, use the notes section in the bonus materials. Feel free to be creative in the way you organize your ideas. What's important is that it resonates with you. I'm often struck by how easy it is to let slip the activities that keep us feeling well. For example, if I'm not careful, I can easily let exercise fall by the wayside. Changes in our lives can also affect our well-being in ways we might not recognize at first, like when friends move away and we lose an important source of support. When we find our mood dropping or anxiety rising, we can consult the plan we laid out for ourselves. By running through the various factors, we can identify ones we need to focus on to feel our best again. Plan to return to your own summary at least weekly and whenever you need reminders about what helps you feel well. Meeting future challenges. Toward the end of our session, I asked John an important question. What could happen that might lead to a major setback if he isn't careful? He answered immediately, if one of my best guys decides to move on, the last time that happened I was a wreck for weeks. I had to pick up the slack while I found someone to take his place, which created strain at home. And the whole process of trying to find someone I can trust really pushes my buttons. Just thinking about it now makes me feel anxious. What if I can't find someone, or I pick someone who's no good? There's so many unknowns. I asked John what tools he has now that he might not have had before. Well, I know now I can deal with my anxiety, which is a total game changer, and I can remind myself to accept the uncertainty and focus on what I can control, because in the end, I know it's going to be okay. He brightened a little. I actually think it'd be a great test of what I've learned. Just as John did, think about any life event that could set you back. Are there events that are possible or even inevitable that you'll need to prepare for? What tools will help you face these challenges? Mindfulness. One of the most helpful tools for staying well is to practice focusing our attention on the present and being open to our experience just as it is. In fact, this approach is embedded throughout this book. For example, in the practice of learning to tolerate uncertainty and accept ourselves, struggles and all. Even recognizing my thoughts as thoughts, not as absolute truth, is part of this practice. The concept of mindfulness describes this present-focused, non-judgmental approach to living. A 2011 Clinical Psychology Review article concluded that training in mindfulness is a powerful protector against relapse following CBT for people with recurrent depression. For example, A 2004 study by Ma and Teasdale found relapse rates were cut by more than 50% among individuals who received mindfulness-based CBT compared to those who got other kinds of therapy. While an exhaustive discussion of mindfulness is beyond the scope of this book, you might consider whether mindfulness could be helpful to you. I've included some resources of mindfulness at the end of the book. Check out your bonus materials to get you started. Additional goals. After several weeks in treatment, John realized there were other life areas he wanted to work on that he hadn't thought of before. For example, he'd felt a certain distance from his wife that he wanted to talk with her about in the near future. He also saw that his sleep had been bad for so long, he'd stopped noticing. He decided to discuss these issues in treatment and address them with the CBT tools at his disposal. Oftentimes after we've learned CBT techniques, we'll start to see other areas of our lives where we could apply them. Clearing away the worst of our anxiety and depression can make room for other things to work on. For example, we might decide to address issues related to our careers, spirituality, relationships, substance use, sleep, or anything else. Have other goals come to mind since you started this program? If so, write them down in your notebook. If not, simply continue focusing on your pre-treatment goals. Saying goodbye. It feels strange to say goodbye to someone I've never met, most likely, and yet I don't want to end without saying it. We've traveled the pages of this book together, I in the writing, you in the doing. As we part ways, I want to thank you for the opportunity to work with you. My hope is that your depression and/or anxiety feel more manageable, and that you feel more connected to your strengths, your loved ones, and your experience. I would also encourage you to expect to still have some struggles. No book and no amount of work will get rid of all anxiety or the ups and downs of being alive. In this context, I often think of a quote from a book by Hermann Hesse called Narcissus and Goldmund. One of the characters says that there is no peace that lives within us constantly and never leaves us. There's only the peace that must be won again and again, each new day of our lives. By finding what works for you and learning to be, in a way, your own therapist, you can find that peace as often as you need to. Chapter Check-in. You've reached the end of this 7-week CBT program. You have no doubt done a great deal of work toward your goals. I hope you're feeling good about the work you've done and the progress you've made. Changing our thoughts and behaviors is hard work. Take a few moments to check in with how you're doing. What do you feel as you reflect on the past few weeks? What are your thoughts as you look to the weeks and months ahead? Activity plan. 1. Keep working up your fear hierarchy if you're practicing facing your fears. 2. Continue to practice the other techniques you found helpful. 3. Return to the relevant chapters as needed. 4. Consult the resources section in the bonus materials for additional tools. The next 7 weeks. Using what you've learned and what to do if you're still struggling. Several years ago, as I was doing physical therapy for a sports-related injury, I was struck by the many parallels between PT and CBT. Like CBT, PT is hard work and requires moving through discomfort to reach a better place. PT also provides a structured plan like CBT does for regaining health and function, and the work between sessions is equally important in therapy for the body and therapy for the mind. The two therapies are also similar in that the issues that brought us to treatment are rarely resolved completely during the course of therapy. Instead, we look for progress to tell us the exercises we're doing are working. If we're moving in the right direction, we're probably practicing the right exercises. After the course of PT is over, we avoid re-injury by continuing a key set of exercises that will keep us well. Now that you've finished this program, the next 7 weeks are a crucial time for you to keep moving in a positive direction. If you've made significant progress during the program, you may be able to cut back on some of the more focused CBT work as you move into a maintenance phase. For example, you may not need to be as strict with scheduling activities or monitoring thoughts. At the same time, beware of subtle ways of losing the ground you've gained. Be especially careful to prevent avoidance, which is powerfully addictive. And while I don't want a person to feel like progress is fragile, it's important to be vigilant for signs of slipping backward so you can employ the tools you have when needed. When in doubt over the next 7 weeks and beyond, err on the side of adhering to the practices that got you better. Remember to refer to your personal plan that summarizes what to do to feel well. When to consult a professional. If you don't feel like this program has helped you, either because it didn't seem to address your struggles or you weren't able to really engage with the program, it may be a good idea to seek professional help. While many people are able to benefit from using a book like this one without a therapist's guidance, others require a higher level of care. The resources section in your bonus materials has websites through which you can find the CBT therapists nearest you. You can also ask your primary care doctor for a recommendation. It's essential that you feel like you have a good working relationship with a therapist, so aim to find a therapist who is a good match for you. Whenever you find yourself at the end of this program, I encourage you to continue pushing ahead toward the life you want. I wish you the very best in the journey. This concludes the reading of Retrain Your Brain: Cognitive Behavioral Therapy in 7 Weeks, a workbook for managing depression and anxiety by Seth J. Gillihan, Ph.D.,